My name is Susan Miller, and I'm 53 years old. I've spent most of my adult life running a business, raising 2 kids, and settling into a marriage that faded into a dull companionship before ending 5 years ago. My children, now grown, live their own busy lives across the country, visiting only on holidays. I'm left here alone in my small suburban house, caught in a loop of mundane days. Wake up, coffee, work, dinner alone, and finally the solace of sleep. It was a Monday like any other. I found myself at the grocery store, pushing my cart through the aisles with the kind of autopilot efficiency that comes with years of routine. But then as I turned into the cereal section, I noticed a man standing there, clearly out of place. He had dark hair, a few curls peeking out from under his cap, and a boyish charm despite being a grown man. He seemed to be around 35, maybe younger. He flashed a smile when our eyes met, an easy grin that crinkled the corners of his blue eyes. "Do you know anything about this stuff?" he asked, holding up a box of granola. "My mom says I should eat healthier, but this looks like rabbit food." I chuckled, surprised by his open demeanor. "It depends on what you like. If you're aiming for healthy but tasty, I'd recommend this one," I said, pointing to a different brand. "Thanks, Susan," he said, glancing at my name tag. "Oh, I must have forgotten to take it off after work. I'm Susan, yes." "Jake," he said, extending a hand. "Nice to meet you." It was a simple interaction, but as I walked away, I realized I felt something I hadn't felt in years. A lightness, a flutter of excitement, like a teenager after her first crush. I shook my head, reminding myself it was just a pleasant conversation. Nothing more. But that was just the beginning. After that first encounter, I thought I'd never see him again. I mean, how often do you bump into the same stranger at the grocery store? But life is funny that way. It was a week later on a rainy Wednesday when I spotted Jake again, this time in the produce section. He was fumbling with a bag of avocados, his expression a mix of concentration and confusion. "Back for more rabbit food?" I teased, stepping beside him. His face lit up when he saw me, as if we were old friends. "Susan, you saved me last time. I'm hoping you'll work your magic again. How do you tell if these things are ripe?" I picked one up, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You want it to give a little but not too much," I explained, handing it to him. He took it from me, our fingers brushing for just a moment, and I felt a warmth that lingered longer than it should have. "You're a lifesaver," he said with a grin. "I've been trying to eat better, but I have no idea what I'm doing. Honestly, I'd probably survive off pizza and soda if it weren't for my mom nagging me." I couldn't help but smile. He was charming in a way that felt genuine, without the polished edges of the men I'd known before. He had an ease about him that made me want to stay and chat a little longer. So I did. We talked for nearly an hour, right there in the middle of the store. He told me about his job at a local construction company, how he'd moved back to town recently to be closer to his mother after she fell ill. I found myself sharing more than I intended to. About my kids, my failed marriage, the quiet emptiness of my house. Before we parted ways, he said, "Hey, you should come by the cafe down the street sometime. I usually grab a coffee there after work. It'd be nice to see a friendly face." I was taken aback. Was he asking me out? No, that couldn't be it. He was just being kind, I told myself. But I couldn't ignore the flutter of excitement in my chest as I nodded and agreed to meet him there sometime. The following day, I found myself at that very cafe, almost without realizing it. And there he was, sitting by the window, looking up from his phone just as I walked in. He waved me over with that same easy smile, and for the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of something I thought I'd lost forever. It was the beginning of our unexpected friendship, a bond that grew stronger with every shared coffee and conversation. He made me laugh like I hadn't in years. We talked about everything: movies, books, his crazy adventures on job sites, and the little quirks of our small town. But there was an undercurrent to it all, something unspoken that neither of us seemed ready to acknowledge. I couldn't help but notice the way his eyes lingered on me, the subtle shift in his tone when he'd tell me I looked nice, even if I was just in jeans and a sweater. It was exciting and terrifying all at once. I hadn't felt this way in decades, and I didn't know what to do with it. It had been months since Jake and I started meeting regularly, and what began as a chance encounter had become a comforting routine. Every Wednesday we'd grab coffee at the little cafe, sitting in our usual spot by the window. He'd tell me stories about his day, his latest projects, mishaps on the construction site, and the antics of his coworkers. I'd listen laughing and feeling more alive than I had in years. One crisp autumn afternoon we met as usual. The sun streamed through the window, casting a golden glow over everything. He looked at me in a way that made my breath hitch, like I was the most interesting person in the room. He reached across the table and brushed a strand of hair from my face, his touch lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. "You've got that look again," he said, grinning. "What look?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The look of someone who's overthinking everything," he teased gently. "Relax, Susan. I'm just happy you're here." I smiled, but inside my heart was racing. When had things changed between us? When had I started looking forward to these afternoons like a teenager anticipating a date? And more importantly, when did I start yearning for more than just these fleeting moments together? That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying our conversations in my mind. I realized with a jolt that I had feelings for Jake. Real, intense, and impossible to ignore. It was like a switch had flipped, and everything I'd been trying to push away came rushing to the surface. This wasn't just friendship anymore. It was something deeper, something that scared me. I was 53, divorced, with 2 grown children. I'd spent the last decade believing that part of my life was over. That romance was a chapter long closed. Yet here I was, feeling butterflies over a man nearly 20 years younger than me. Felt absurd, almost ridiculous. But it also felt exhilarating. I tried to rationalize it away. Maybe it was just the attention. After all, it had been so long since anyone looked at me the way Jake did. But that wasn't it. It wasn't just his looks, though he was handsome with his playful grin and strong jawline. It was the way he listened, the way he made me feel seen, understood, like I was more than just a middle-aged woman living a quiet life. I knew I had a choice to make. I could pull back, create distance before these feelings became any more intense. Or I could lean into it, take a risk, and see where this unexpected connection could lead. The thought terrified me, but it also filled me with a sense of excitement I hadn't felt in years. I turned over in bed, hugging my pillow, a small smile tugging at my lips despite the uncertainty swirling inside me. For the first time in a long time, I realized I was falling for someone, falling for him. And there was no going back now. I couldn't stop thinking about Jake. He was everywhere, in my thoughts when I woke up, in the quiet moments during my workday, and in the lonely hours of the night when I lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, wondering what he was doing. It was like being caught in a tidal wave of emotions I hadn't felt in decades. And it was terrifying. I found myself studying my reflection in the bathroom mirror more often than usual. I traced the lines around my eyes, the gray streaks in my hair, the softened jawline that once was sharper. I couldn't help but compare myself to the women I assumed Jake usually dated, women in their 20s or 30s, with taut skin and endless energy. What would people say if they saw us together? They'd think I was some desperate older woman, clinging to the attention of a younger man. They'd assume he was just using me, or worse, that I was fooling myself into believing he could actually care about me. One evening I met up with an old friend for dinner, Linda, who's known me since high school. Over wine she asked me why I seemed different, happier even. I hesitated, then confessed, "I've been spending time with someone, a man." Her eyebrows shot up, and I could see the gears turning in her mind. "Tell me everything," she said, leaning in. "His name is Jake." I began, feeling both excited and vulnerable. "He's younger." "How much younger?" she pressed, eyes wide with curiosity. "About 18 years, I said, bracing myself. Linda's expression shifted from surprise to something bordering on pity. "Susan," she began cautiously, "you've got to be careful. A man that much younger, what could he possibly want from a woman our age?" I felt the sting of her words, but I forced a smile. "He's different, Linda. He makes me feel seen in a way I haven't felt in a long time." She sighed, giving my hand a sympathetic pat. "I just don't want you to get hurt. Men like him, they have their whole lives ahead of them. He might be enjoying the attention now, but what happens when he wants kids, or a younger wife to build a life with?" I nodded, even though her words felt like tiny daggers. It was everything I'd already been telling myself. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was just a fling for him, something temporary to fill a void. But when I was with Jake, it didn't feel temporary. It felt real. It felt like the start of something I'd been missing, something I wasn't sure I'd ever find again. That weekend, I decided to take a walk through the park. It was one of those perfect autumn days, with a crisp breeze and golden leaves crunching underfoot. I found myself wishing Jake were there with me, sharing the moment, holding my hand. I didn't realize how much I wanted it until the thought made my chest ache. Lost in my thoughts, I nearly jumped when I felt a hand slip into mine. I turned, and there he was, Jake, standing beside me, his eyes filled with that familiar warmth. "You looked like you could use some company," he said softly, squeezing my hand. I tried to pull away, but he held on. "Jake, what are we doing?" I blurted out, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I'm twice your age. People will talk. They'll think this is just some passing fling for you." He stopped walking and turned to face me, his expression serious now. "Susan, I don't care what anyone thinks. And this isn't a fling. It's you. I want you," he said, his voice steady, his eyes searching mine. In that moment, all my fears and doubts seemed to dissolve. I felt a rush of warmth, a dizzying mix of relief and joy. I realized then that it didn't matter what anyone else thought. For the first time in years, I felt alive, truly deeply alive. I squeezed his hand back, feeling tears well up in my eyes. "I want you too, Jake," I whispered, my voice breaking. He pulled me into his arms, right there in the middle of the park, and I let myself sink into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against mine. It was reckless and terrifying, but it was also everything I hadn't known I needed. The days after Jake and I shared that moment in the park were a blur of excitement and fear, the joy of being together clouded by my constant questioning. I kept telling myself I was just overthinking things. After all, Jake seemed so sure of us, of me. But the weight of my own insecurities wouldn't let me shake the nagging feeling that I was playing with fire. I had never been the type to rush into things. In my past relationships, I'd taken my time, gotten to know the person, built a foundation. But this was different. With Jake, everything felt urgent, like the pull between us was impossible to ignore. Every time we were together, I couldn't stop thinking about how much I wanted him, how much I craved his presence, his touch. But inviting him over to my house was a step I wasn't sure I was ready to take. My home had always been a place of comfort, a sanctuary from the world, and I'd spent so many years building walls around it. What would happen if he came inside? Would it change things? Would it complicate everything? One evening, as we sat in the cafe, I couldn't help but let the words slip. "Jake," I started hesitantly. "I've been thinking." He raised an eyebrow, leaning in. "About what?" "About inviting you over," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. "To my place." He smiled warmly, like the idea was exactly what he'd been hoping for. "I'd love that," he said, his voice soft. "I can't wait." But as soon as the words left his mouth, I felt a rush of nerves flood my system. I was overthinking again. What if it didn't go the way I imagined? What if he only saw my home as a place to visit, and not a reflection of something deeper? Later that night, as I stood in front of my mirror, I considered what I was about to do. I would be inviting a younger man into my life, into my home, where I'd spent years carving out a quiet existence. I wasn't naive enough to believe this would be a simple visit. It was more than that. It was a step toward something bigger, something that I wasn't sure I was ready for. But then I remembered the way he looked at me, the way he touched me as though he had all the time in the world, as though nothing else mattered but the moment we shared. For the first time in years, I felt desired, not just physically but emotionally, in a way that went beyond my age, my past, and all the things I thought I'd lost. I had to take the leap. If this was going to be something real, it had to be with all of me, no more holding back, no more second-guessing. I picked up my phone and sent him a message. "Tomorrow evening, 7 p.m. I'll be waiting." His response came instantly. "Can't wait." The evening arrived with an anticipation I couldn't shake. I had spent the entire afternoon preparing, but no matter how much I tidied up or set the table, I couldn't quell the flutter of nerves deep in my stomach. Was I ready for this? Was I ready for him to see all of me? My home, my life, everything I'd built since my divorce? What if he didn't feel the same when he saw the real me, not just the woman I appeared to be in the cafe or on our walks in the park? When Jake finally arrived, looking effortlessly handsome in a simple shirt and jeans, all those worries seemed to vanish. He greeted me with a warm, lingering kiss on the cheek, and for the first time, I noticed how the air around us seemed to crackle with electricity. There was no going back now. "Your place is beautiful," he said, his eyes scanning the living room with genuine admiration. "It feels like home." I smiled, grateful for his kind words. "Thank you. It's been a while since I've had company over." He nodded, taking in the soft lighting, the comfortable sofa, the pictures on the walls. "You've got a good vibe here," he said, his voice carrying a hint of awe. I offered him a drink, and as we sat down at the table, the conversation flowed easily, as it always did between us. It was like old friends reconnecting, except now there was an undeniable tension hanging between us. Something neither of us wanted to acknowledge at first but both felt deep down. When dinner was finished, we moved to the living room, sitting on the couch. Jake's hand brushed against mine and I froze, unsure of what to do next. It had been so long since I'd felt this kind of nervous excitement. The last time I'd been in a relationship, I was in my 40s, things had moved slower then. But now? With Jake, it was as if the world had sped up, and everything was rushing toward this one moment. His hand gently cupped mine, his fingers tracing soft circles on my skin. "I've wanted to do this for a long time," he said, his voice low as though testing the waters. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already knew. "This," he said, his eyes searching mine, his face just inches from my own. "I've wanted to be close to you. To feel this." He moved in, and before I could think, his lips were on mine, soft and eager, with a tenderness that sent a shockwave through me. I responded almost instinctively, leaning into him, letting the kiss deepen. I could feel the warmth of his body, the steady pulse of his heart as it matched my own. It was as though the world outside my home had ceased to exist. There was no age gap, no judgment, no expectations. There was only him and me, caught in a moment that felt like it was always meant to happen. His hands moved gently, tracing the curve of my arm, sending tingles of excitement wherever his fingers brushed. I hesitated for a moment, uncertainty creeping in again. But the way he looked at me, his eyes filled with warmth, with desire, made me forget all my doubts. He pulled back, his forehead resting against mine. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice hushed, his breath mingling with mine. I swallowed, trying to steady my racing heart. "I'm sure," I whispered, and I meant it. And with that, the tension that had been building between us was released. We moved together in a way that felt both new and familiar, as if we had known each other much longer than just a few months. There was an intimacy in the way he touched me, gentle yet insistent, as though he was claiming a space in my life that had been empty for far too long. Later, as we lay together, tangled in the sheets, I couldn't help but reflect on how different this was from anything I'd known. It wasn't just about the physical closeness. It was the emotional connection that had grown between us. He saw me, really saw me, in a way no one else had for years. And I realized with a surge of emotion that I saw him too. Not just as a younger man, not just as a fleeting moment of passion, but as someone who mattered. Someone who could matter. Jake shifted beside me, his hand resting on my stomach. "You're amazing," he said softly, his voice thick with sleep. I turned to face him, smiling despite the vulnerability that settled over me. "So are you, Jake." It was a simple statement, but it held everything we had shared in that moment. A bond that was more than just physical, more than just fleeting attraction. It was something that felt deep and real, something that could grow if we let it. The next morning I woke up to the quiet hum of the world outside, the soft light filtering through the curtains. Jake was still asleep beside me, his arm draped over my waist, his breath slow and steady. I lay there for a moment, watching him, taking in the peace of the moment. It felt like something new had bloomed in my life overnight. A new possibility, a new sense of purpose. I carefully moved from the bed, not wanting to wake him, and slipped into the kitchen. As I brewed coffee, my thoughts swirled. I had never imagined I would find myself here, with him in this moment. I had never imagined falling in love again, let alone with someone so much younger. It was a thought that still made me uneasy at times. Society had its judgments, its whispers, its expectations. I wasn't naive. I knew the looks people would give us if they saw us together. I knew the whispers that would follow, the quiet disapproval that would likely be expressed behind closed doors. But as I sipped my coffee and looked out at the quiet morning, I realized something important. Those judgments didn't matter. What mattered was what I felt in my heart. What mattered was the connection we had built. The way Jake had made me feel seen and desired in a way I hadn't felt in years. Age was just a number. Yes, it came with its own set of challenges, things I couldn't ignore. But it also came with a wisdom, a maturity that allowed me to embrace this love for what it was, not for what others might think of it. I thought back to the conversations we'd had, the way Jake had opened up to me about his own fears, his own desires. I thought about how we shared so much more than just our bodies, that our connection ran deeper than anything I had experienced in years. He didn't see me as just an older woman. He saw me as Susan, the woman with a life, with dreams, with stories to tell. He saw me as someone worthy of love, of respect, of passion. I caught myself smiling, something I hadn't done in a long time. It wasn't just because Jake had swept me off my feet in a physical sense. It was because he had touched something deeper inside of me, something that had been dormant for too long. It was a feeling of being whole again, of rediscovering parts of myself that I had buried beneath the weight of my responsibilities as a mother, as a woman who had once believed that romance and passion were things of the past. When Jake finally woke up, he found me sitting on the couch, lost in thought. His eyes softened when he saw me, and he joined me, wrapping his arms around me in a quiet embrace. "What's on your mind?" he asked, brushing a lock of hair from my face. I turned to him, meeting his gaze. "I'm just thinking," I said quietly, "about everything. About us." He smiled, his fingers tracing my arm. "What about us?" I hesitated for a moment, wondering how to put my feelings into words. "I don't know what this will look like in the future, Jake. I don't know what people will think. But I know I've never felt this way before. You make me feel alive. Like I'm not just the woman I used to be, but someone who can still feel deeply, who can still love with everything I have." He kissed me softly on the forehead. "We don't have to figure everything out right now. We've got time." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words. We did have time. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel rushed. I didn't feel like I had to worry about what the world might think of us. I knew that we were creating something real, something meaningful, something that didn't fit into the neat boxes society liked to put people into, but something that felt right for us. As I sat there with Jake by my side, I realized that love, in all its forms, was a force that transcended age, appearance, and expectations. It didn't care about the number of years between two people. It didn't care about the labels society wanted to put on relationships. Love, I realized, was simply about connection, about two souls finding one another, and deciding to walk through life together. I didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, I was willing to embrace it, fully and without reservation. The days turned into weeks, and as we settled into this new rhythm of life together, I found myself embracing each moment more fully than I ever thought possible. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt, moments where the weight of society's judgments seemed to press down harder than others. But those moments were fleeting. They were drowned out by the laughter we shared, by the quiet comfort of simply being in each other's presence, by the undeniable bond that had formed between us. Jake and I didn't have it all figured out. There were conversations we still needed to have, adjustments to make, and perhaps a few hurdles to overcome. But none of that felt like an obstacle. Instead, it felt like a journey. One that we were taking together, with open hearts and an openness to whatever the future might bring. I had always believed that love was something that happened in stages, that it was something you built over time, and that with age came a kind of resignation to the idea that the best years of love were behind you. But Jake had shown me something different. Love wasn't just about youthful passion or the carefree days of our younger years. It was about connection, about sharing parts of yourself with someone who truly saw you, who cherished you for who you were, not for what the world said you should be. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, watching the sunset, I turned to Jake, the person who had turned my world upside down in the most beautiful way. "I never imagined I'd be here at this point in my life feeling this way again," I said, my voice full of wonder. "I thought love was behind me, that it was something for the young." Jake smiled and took my hand in his fingers warm against my skin. "Love doesn't have an age limit, Susan," he said softly. "It's just about finding the right person at the right time. And I think we found each other." I squeezed his hand, feeling the weight of his words settle into my chest. I used to think that love had an expiration date. I confessed that I was too old, too set in my ways. But you've shown me that love doesn't care about age. It doesn't care about anything but the connection we have. And as I said those words, I knew that they were true, not just for us, but for anyone who dared to love without boundaries. Love was meant to be experienced fully at any age, in any form. It wasn't about fitting into someone else's expectations. It was about finding what made you feel whole, what made your heart beat faster, what made you feel seen and heard. Looking at Jake, I realized that the love we shared wasn't just a beautiful chapter in my life. It was a new beginning. It was proof that love could come at any age, in any form, and that we should never be afraid to embrace it, even when the world might say it's unconventional. I had learned to embrace what felt right for me, without worrying about the judgments of others. We didn't need to define it in any other terms. What we had was real. It was our love, and it was enough. And so, with the sun setting behind us and Jake's hand in mine, I knew that we would face whatever came our way together. I had found happiness when I least expected it, and I wasn't going to let anything stand in